This is the guy who started the government shutdown among the House Republicans.
You know, it's interesting when the more we find out, the more we realize how wrong the direction we're going. And so what we're going to do is take back our country. 2012 is the time that we're going to send Mr. Obama home to Kenya or wherever it is. We're going to do it.
Send him home to Kenya. That is Mark Meadows, freshman Republican from North Carolina. Freshman. He was elected last year, and he was elected last year as a birther. I mean, 2012. Long after most of the birther movement had folded up their long-form birth certificates and gone home, good old Mark Meadows in North Carolina was still out there running, campaigning openly in 2012 on birtherism.
If the president is not a natural-born citizen, then he does not control the military. And so the question I have, if you're sent to Congress, will you pursue some kind of investigation to find out whether or not this guy is really a citizen and entitled to those authorities?
Yes. You know, I see it as if we do our job from a grassroots standpoint, we won't have to worry about it. You know what? We'll send him back home to Kenya or wherever it is.
Despite his promises on the campaign trail, Congressman Mark Meadows does not seem to have spent much time investigating the president's secret birthplace in Kenya. But Mark Meadows has really made a mark. It was the birther congressman, Mark Meadows, who wrote that letter to John Boehner last month demanding that he make funding the government contingent on killing Obamacare, demanding that John Boehner shut down the government if Obamacare couldn't be stopped. Mark Meadows got 80 signatures in Congress for that letter, and John Boehner shut down the government by exactly the means that Mark Meadows demanded. And that is how we got to where we are now. And the fact that this shutdown started with a guy who was still running as a birther in 2012 ought to have been more of a signal than it has been about this overall effort. And interestingly, it is the local papers around the country that have started to pick up on this aspect of it, maybe even more than the Beltway press. In Illinois, the paper in Springfield, the Journal-Register, tracked down their two local Republican congressmen who'd signed on to the Mark Meadows letter and asked those congressmen, hey, are you guys signing on with this guy for everything? You signed his shutdown letter. Are you birthers too? Staffers for both those congressmen immediately tried to distance their bosses from Mark Meadows, at least on the birther front. The office of Congressman Rodney Davis told the Springfield paper, those birther comments are obviously wrong and highly disrespectful to the president. The office of Congressman Aaron Schock said those comments by that member of Congress are clearly disrespectful, and Congressman Schock does not associate himself with those comments at all. So those congressmen do not agree with the birther part of the agenda of the guy whose shutdown they signed on for. But it is more important than the Beltway gives it credit for that this is where our current national crisis sprung from. The failure to recognize that the shutdown really came from the fringe, from the side that was still birther in 2012, has led, I think, to a failure of good predictions at a time when we need them. It's a really historically important moment in American politics, and we really have only very fuzzy ideas about what's going to happen next. And this is the most mainstream story in the world, right? The federal government is freaking shut down for 2 weeks now. We're facing economic apocalypse with the debt ceiling collapse, which is due on Thursday. And so every American has a stake in this very big story. And every local news outlet and every anchor and every pundit in the country, everybody talking on every street corner, is trying to understand this crisis, trying to predict where this is going to go. And to do that accurately, you have to know where the crisis is coming from. And where this crisis is coming from is not a mainstream place. The mainstream and the rest of politics are playing with a different deck of cards from the guys who started this thing. I don't mean it in a derogatory way, I mean it in a descriptive way. They have a different set of values. They have a different sense of what is normal. They have a different sense of what counts as reasonable politics in America. And failing to appreciate that means we fail to develop reasonably accurate expectations for their behavior. And that has become really important. So the polling comes out, the Gallup poll and the NBC Wall Street Journal poll and the Washington Post ABC poll and the CNN poll and the Pew Research Center polling, all this new polling, scientifically polling Americans, showing that Americans hate the shutdown and they blame Republicans for it. You might expect that to cause Republicans to alter their behavior or at least try to rebut the presumptions behind those opinions in the polls. But instead, the response from the drivers of the shutdown is, polls. Those are skewed. We have our own poll. Ted Cruz did pay for his own poll to rebut the other real ones. And his own poll shows that Republicans are doing great. Jim DeMint, on the occasion of week 2 of the shutdown that has infuriated the nation, is still describing it as a temporary slowdown. There is no shutdown at all in the wonderful world of Jim DeMint. Things are going great. Predicting their behavior can't be done accurately if you think they're like people who are afraid by those poll numbers. They're not afraid by them. Consider where these guys are coming from. Look at their milieu. Look at the people they hear from. Look at where Ted Cruz and Jim DeMint are spending this weekend. They're both at the Values Voter Summit this weekend. Both Ted Cruz and Jim DeMint sharing the schedule with birther luminaries like conservative talk show host Sandy Rios, who had this to say about the recent terror attack at that mall in Kenya.
The implications of this are pretty frightening, and of course, it's interesting that this is the country from which our president hails. This is his lineage. We know that his cousin, Raila Odinga, is a Muslim communist. It's just amazing. I think he's the prime minister right now.
Actually, not the prime minister of Kenya anymore, not a Muslim, not a communist, and not the president's cousin. Ted Cruz and Jim DeMint are spending the weekend with people like Sandy Rios and with birthers who attempt to sound more reasonable, like Frank Gaffney.
On so many other points involved in this issue, however, for example, where the president himself was born, there seems to have been, well, a lack of documentation, to say the least, to put it, again, charitably. What's going on with that?
Want to know who's doing the plenary session at the Values Voter Summit with Jim DeMint and Ted Cruz this weekend? Want to know? Yeah.
Are you out of your mind? America, I ask you sincerely, are you out of your mind? I mean, I really sincerely thought this weekend, you know, maybe it's time to move to Canada. Maybe it's time to move to Canada because these people are not screwing around. If you don't think they're going to scoop people up, they will. They've upped it now. Now they're putting a bigger fence around. Now they're putting armed guards around it. This is the beginning of teaching the American people a lesson. Don't you screw with us.
He used to be on TV. He's now on the internet machine, but he will be hosting the afternoon plenary session at the Values Voter Summit tomorrow. And then they can all settle in for a breakout session with Joseph Farah, who makes a living selling birther bumper stickers. Where's the real birth certificate? Along with specialty items like the real birth certificate book. Joseph Farah is also warning if it would come to this, because you have a secret Muslim gay Chicago-style gangster president who quite possibly was not even born, but was just found under a rock somewhere in the Serengeti. This is where the drivers of the Republican government shutdown are spending their weekend. This is their milieu. This crisis in Washington right now is not a normal Republican versus Democrat fight that can be understood through the lens of previous Republican versus Democrat fights. If this were normal Democrats versus normal Republicans, this would be resolved by now. What happened inside the Republican Party is they really handed this one over to the fringe. And it means that anybody who's operating under anything that we can learn from a previous political playbook is wrong. There's no way to make predictions about what happens now without understanding where this all started.